It started with a voicemail that arrived just after midnight, a time when the world feels quieter, lonelier. I was lying on my couch, half asleep with a documentary playing on low volume, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. It startled me, but not enough to fully wake me. I let it go to voicemail, figuring it was probably spam. Lately, I'd been getting calls from strange numbers, automated messages about car warranties, surveys, scams. Nothing worth my attention. The next morning, I almost forgot about it until I saw the notification on my screen. One new voicemail. The number was unfamiliar, no name, no contact photo, just a string of digits that didn't match any area code I recognized. I pressed play, expecting a robotic voice or dead air. What I heard was faint, almost inaudible at first. There was static, like a weak signal, and then a voice. A strained, whispering voice. It said my name. David. My stomach tightened. It wasn't just the way the voice sounded, distant and muffled. It was the fact that it knew me. The recording continued, barely louder than a breath. David, you have to come back, please. Finish what you started. The message ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the screen. I hit replay, cranking the volume up, trying to make sense of it. The voice was distorted, but it felt disturbingly familiar, like a memory buried just out of reach. I couldn't place it, but something about the tone, the way my name was said, sent a shiver down my spine. The day passed in a fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that the message wasn't random, that it wasn't some prank or technical glitch. It felt personal, intimate in a way that made my skin crawl. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. But when night came, I couldn't sleep. The calls started again the next night. This time I was wide awake when the phone buzzed. The same number. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, willing myself to let it go to voicemail again. The buzzing stopped, and a few seconds later, another notification appeared. New voicemail. I didn't listen right away. Something about it felt wrong, like opening the door to someone who wasn't supposed to be there. But curiosity, or maybe something darker, got the better of me. I tapped the message. David, you promised. Don't you remember? Please, come back. The voice was trembling, more urgent this time. The static seemed thicker, like a storm was brewing on the other end. The line went quiet for a moment before the voice returned, lower, almost guttural. You can't leave it like this. You have to finish it. I turned off my phone and paced the room. Who was this? What were they talking about? I tried to think of anything, any promise, any unfinished business that could explain the calls, but nothing came to mind. Nothing, that is. Until I thought about the phone. I almost laughed at how ridiculous the idea was, but the thought dug its claws into me. Years ago, I'd buried an old phone. It had been a strange, impulsive thing to do, but at the time, it had felt necessary. I didn't want it around anymore, didn't want the memories tied to it. And so, one night, I'd taken it to a secluded spot in the woods and buried it under a shallow layer of earth. I hadn't thought about it in years. But now the calls, the voice, it felt connected, as if the past was clawing its way back to me. I told myself there was no way. The phone was dead. The battery had long since drained. It was impossible for it to be making calls. And yet the more I tried to dismiss the thought, the more it festered. The third night, the call came later, almost 3 a.m. I didn't wait for it to go to voicemail this time. My hand shook as I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear. Who is this? I demanded. Static answered me. My own breathing sounded unnaturally loud in the silence that followed. And then the voice came through, faint but distinct. David, why won't you listen? You can't run from this. What are you talking about? Who are you? My voice cracked. I felt foolish, like I was screaming into a void. The static grew louder, warping into something sharp, grating. The voice cut through it like a blade. Come back. You know where? The line went dead. My pulse was hammering, and my palms were slick with sweat. The voice, whoever it belonged to, wasn't just familiar. It was mine. Or at least it sounded like me. a distorted, desperate version of my own voice. The realization sent a chill rippling through me. I spent the next day trying to rationalize it. Maybe I'd been hacked. Maybe someone was playing an elaborate trick. But even as I tried to explain it away, something darker gnawed at the edges of my mind. Memories I'd pushed down. Things I'd tried to forget. That night I couldn't stay in my apartment. I drove aimlessly for hours, hoping the open road would clear my head. But the roads felt empty, almost too quiet. Even the air seemed heavier, like the world was holding its breath. My phone sat in the passenger seat, dark and silent. It was only when I parked outside an all-night diner, trying to convince myself to go inside for coffee, that it buzzed again. This time I didn't hesitate. I snatched the phone and answered, my voice sharp with fear and anger. "What do you want from me?" The voice on the other end wasn't faint anymore. It was loud, clear, and relentless. "You have to come back. Finish it. You know where it is." "Stop calling me," I snapped. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the voice didn't falter. If anything, it sounded amused, as if my denial was expected. I hung up, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the phone. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked pale, gaunt. I barely recognized myself. The exhaustion, the fear it was eating away at me. I had to end this. There was only one way. I had to go back. The woods had changed in the years since I'd last been there. The path I used to know so well was overgrown, wild branches clawing at my jacket as I pushed through the underbrush. The air was thick and damp, clinging to my skin in a way that made it hard to breathe. I hadn't brought a flashlight, just the dim glow of my phone screen to guide me. It felt reckless, but I hadn't been thinking clearly when I left the apartment. I just knew I couldn't wait another night. As I walked deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world seemed to fall away. No wind rustling through the trees, no chirping of crickets. Just the crunch of my footsteps on the leaf-strewn ground, and the faint, steady hum of static coming from my pocket. I pulled out my phone, but the screen was blank. The static wasn't coming from a call, it was coming from somewhere else. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But every time I stopped to listen, there was nothing. Only silence. I wasn't entirely sure I remembered the exact spot where I'd buried the phone. It had been a hasty decision, made in the middle of the night, with no thought to landmarks or markers. But as I pressed on, something in the landscape began to feel familiar. A twisted tree with gnarled roots. A patch of ground that dipped slightly, forming a shallow bowl. My heart sank when I realized I'd found it. The spot where I'd buried my past. The earth was soft from recent rain, but digging with my bare hands was harder than I expected. Dirt caked my nails, and every handful felt like I was pulling at something heavy, reluctant to let go. My breaths came in short gasps, and the metallic tang of sweat filled my mouth. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, a shattered relic of an old life, maybe. Or nothing at all, the phone long gone, swallowed by the earth. But when my fingers scraped against something hard and smooth, I froze. I pulled it free, my hands trembling as the object came into view. It was the phone, exactly as I remembered it. The case was cracked, the screen shattered, but it was unmistakably the same. A phone that shouldn't have been working, shouldn't have been able to call me. And yet, as I stared at it, the screen flickered to life. One new voicemail. I didn't want to listen. My instinct screamed at me to smash the thing against a rock, to bury it again and walk away. But my fingers moved on their own, tapping the notification, bringing the message to life. The voice was louder now, more insistent. It was me, there was no doubt about that anymore. My own voice, but raw and ragged, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Anger. Despair. Fear. "You can't ignore this, David. You know what you did." My hands clenched around the phone. I didn't do anything, I said aloud, as if speaking into the woods could make the voice go away. The message continued, overlapping itself, a maddening loop of my own words distorted into something alien. "Finish it. Finish it. Finish it." The screen went black, and the silence that followed was deafening. I dropped the phone, backing away like it was a live wire. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the answers felt just out of reach, taunting me like the fragments of a dream I couldn't quite remember. And then I heard a sound that stopped me cold. It was faint at first, blending with the whisper of the wind, but it grew louder with each passing second. A rustling, scraping noise like something heavy dragging itself across the forest floor. My breath hitched, and I spun around, searching the shadows for the source. But the woods were empty. Still. The sound came again, closer this time, and my chest tightened. I thought about running, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. It was only when the sound stopped, replaced by a low, guttural breathing, that I forced myself to turn. At first I didn't see anything. Just the trees, their twisted shapes casting long shadows in the faint moonlight. But then, in the corner of my vision, something moved. A figure, hunched and indistinct, emerging from the darkness. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by clumsy hands. "Who's there?" My voice came out shaky, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It just kept coming, dragging itself closer, its face obscured by shadow. I took a step back, and my foot caught on a root. I stumbled, landing hard on the ground, the air knocked from my lungs. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The woods were still again, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. The phone buzzed in the dirt beside me, the screen lighting up with another notification. Incoming call. I stared at it, my body frozen with fear. The number on the screen wasn't the unknown string I'd seen before. It was my number, my own phone calling me. The sight of my own number on the screen was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. My breath caught in my throat as the phone buzzed insistently, the screen glowing in the darkness like a tiny beacon. The air around me felt charged, thick with something unseen. Every instinct screamed at me to leave the phone where it was, to turn and run, but my body refused to listen. My hand moved toward it, trembling as if guided by something other than my own will. I picked up the phone, my heart hammering in my chest as I hesitated. The buzzing stopped. For a moment I thought it was over, that whatever nightmare I had stumbled into had ended. But the phone lit up again, this time with a voicemail notification. One new voicemail. The screen blinked, waiting for me to act. My thumb hovered over the play button, and I cursed myself for even considering it. But the curiosity, the need to know, was stronger than my fear. I pressed play. The message was different this time. No static, no faint voice struggling to be heard. Instead, there was silence. And then, slowly, something began to emerge. It wasn't words at first, just a sound, wet and heavy, like someone breathing through water. And then the voice came, deep and guttural, barely resembling my own anymore. "You can't run, David. You can't hide. You know what you have to do." I was shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. "I don't know what you're talking about," I shouted into the void. My voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the trees. The message ended abruptly, but before I could process it, the phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a call. It was a video. I hesitated for only a moment before tapping the notification. The screen went black, and then an image flickered to life. It was grainy, like old security footage, but I recognized the scene immediately. It was the woods, this very spot. And in the center of the frame was a figure. It was me. The version of me on the screen looked wild, disheveled. My clothes were torn, and my face was smeared with dirt. I was holding something, a shovel. My heart sank as I watched myself dig into the ground, my movements frantic and desperate. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The me in the video stopped digging, turning toward the camera as if he'd heard me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark, and when he spoke, his voice came through the phone, perfectly synchronized with his lips. "You know what you buried here, David. You know why. But it won't stay buried." The screen went black, and the phone slipped from my fingers. My mind was reeling, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve snapping into place. Memories I had buried as deeply as the phone began to surface, unbidden and merciless. There had been another night, years ago. A stormy night when the woods felt alive with something hostile. I had been here digging, but not just to bury a phone. There was something else, someone else. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the ground, the realization hitting me like a blow to the chest. I remembered Flash's panicked hands gripping a heavy object, dragging something through the underbrush, a shallow grave hastily covered as rain poured down around me. I thought I could forget. I thought I could leave it behind, pretend it had never happened. But the calls, the voicemails, the thing in the woods, they were proof that the past doesn't stay buried. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the phone like a lifeline as I backed away from the spot where the truth lay waiting. But the woods had changed again. The path I'd come down was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of trees that seemed to press closer with every step. The dragging sound returned, louder now, echoing all around me. I turned wildly, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive darkness and the rustling of leaves that seemed to mock me. And then from the shadows, a voice spoke. "You can't leave, David. You brought this here." It was the same voice from the phone, but now it was all around me, impossible to pinpoint. I turned in circles, my breathing ragged, my vision blurring with panic. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The dragging sound grew closer, and I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs contorted in ways that made my stomach churn. It stepped into the dim light filtering through the branches, and I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its skin was pale and smooth, featureless except for a gaping hole where its mouth should have been. But it didn't need a mouth to speak. The voice came from everywhere, as if the forest itself were alive. "You can't hide from what you've done." I stumbled backward, the phone slipping from my grasp and landing in the dirt. The screen lit up one last time, displaying a single message in bold, glaring text. "Dig." My hands moved before I could think, clawing at the earth like a man possessed. The soil was damp and heavy, but I dug with a frenzied determination, driven by something I couldn't name. My nails cracked, and my skin tore, but I didn't stop until my hands hit something solid. A shape emerged from the dirt, wrapped in tattered fabric. My stomach turned as I pulled at it, revealing what lay beneath. A face, pale and lifeless, stared back at me. I knew that face. I knew it because it was mine. I stumbled back, falling onto the damp ground as the lifeless face stared up at me. It was mine, unmistakably mine, an exact replica down to the faint scar under my left eyebrow. My breaths came in shallow gasps, the world tilting and spinning around me. The corpse was twisted, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and yet the face was pristine, as though it had been waiting there for me all along. My mind screamed at me to look away, to get up and run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped by the impossible horror in front of me. Its hand was partially exposed from beneath the tattered fabric. The fingers were stiff, curled as if they had been reaching for something in their final moments. A voice low and chilling broke the silence. "You can't run from yourself, David." The words weren't coming from me. They weren't coming from the woods or the phone or the air. They were coming from the body. The corpse's head twisted, the motion sickeningly slow and deliberate. My eyes snapped open, dull and clouded, but somehow alive. Its mouth moved, dry and creaking, as if the act of speaking was tearing something loose. "You left me here." "No," I choked out, shaking my head. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." It sat up, bones cracking and popping, the shroud falling away to reveal a body that was both familiar and wrong. Its chest barely moved as it rasped out words, each one digging into me like a knife. "You buried me. You thought you could forget, but I never forgot." I waited. I scrambled to my feet, the world tilting as I backed away. "You're not me," I whispered. "You can't be me." It stood, its movements jerky, its head tilting unnaturally as it studied me. "I'm everything you tried to hide, everything you tried to leave behind, and now it's time to finish what you started." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling at my feet as though the earth itself wanted to swallow me whole. The dragging sound returned, louder and closer, and I realized it wasn't just coming from the woods anymore. It was coming from the thing in front of me. It stepped forward, dragging one leg behind it, the sound reverberating through my skull. I turned and ran, branches whipping against my face as I tore through the underbrush. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were moving through quicksand, but I didn't stop. Behind me, the dragging sound followed, relentless and steady, accompanied by my own voice echoing through the trees. "You can't run, David. You can't run from yourself." I burst into a clearing, my breath hitching as I stumbled into the open space. Moonlight bathed the area in a pale glow, illuminating a single figure standing in the center. It was the tall, faceless thing I had seen before, its gaping mouth twisting into something that resembled a grin. Its long, skeletal arm pointed toward the ground, where the phone lay, screen glowing once more. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to run, to turn away, but the pull was too strong. I moved toward it, my legs trembling with every step. The phone buzzed as I reached it, a new message flashing on the screen. "It's time." The faceless figure stepped closer, and the dragging sound returned, louder than ever. I turned my head, and my corpse emerged from the trees, its hollow eyes locked on me. It moved with purpose now, no longer stiff or awkward. It was gaining strength. "You know what you buried," it said, the words dripping with accusation. "You know what you did." "No," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I don't remember. I don't know." "Liar," it hissed, and the faceless figure echoed the word, its voice a low, guttural growl. My knees gave out, and I collapsed beside the phone, the glowing screen illuminating my trembling hands. Memories flooded back in broken fragments, flashes of anger, guilt, and a night I had spent years trying to forget. There had been someone else with me in the woods that night. A confrontation. An argument. I remembered shouting, the weight of something heavy in my hands, and then the sickening realization that I had gone too far. I buried the truth here, not just the phone. The phone was a tether, a desperate attempt to lock away the guilt. But the woods hadn't forgotten. The ground itself seemed to pulse beneath me, alive with the memories I had tried to suppress. The corpse stood over me now, its face contorted into a grotesque parody of mine. Its hand reached out, fingers curling around my arm with an iron grip. "You can't leave," it said, its voice calm, final. "This is where you belong." The faceless figure loomed behind it, its skeletal hand resting on my shoulder, impossibly cold. The dragging sound was all around me now, an oppressive weight that pressed into my chest. The phone buzzed one last time, the screen flashing a single word. "Confess." "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to kill you." The forest went still. The dragging sound stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The corpse stared at me, its hollow eyes unreadable, and then, slowly, it began to smile. The faceless figure stepped back, its grin widening as it melted into the shadows. The corpse released its grip, collapsing into a pile of dirt and broken bones. The phone flickered, its screen cracking and dimming, until it was nothing but a lifeless husk. But I didn't feel relief. The woods were watching, their silence heavy with judgment. And as I stood there, alone and trembling, I realized the truth. This wasn't over. It would never be over. The past doesn't stay buried. I staggered back from the pile of dirt and broken bones, my legs unsteady, as if the ground beneath me had shifted. The phone lay inert now, its screen dark, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it again. The woods were suffocating in their silence, every tree and shadow pressing down on me, as if the entire forest was alive and bearing witness. I whispered to myself, "It's done. It's over." But deep down, I didn't believe it. The air felt too still, the moment too charged with something I couldn't name. I turned, intending to leave this cursed place behind once and for all, but as I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, I froze. The path was gone. The way I'd come in, the overgrown trail I had stumbled through earlier, had vanished entirely. In its place was an unbroken wall of trees, their twisted branches intertwined like claws, as if they'd grown together to block my escape. My chest tightened, and panic clawed at my throat. I spun in circles, searching for any sign of an exit, but the forest had shifted, closing in around me like a trap. A sound broke the silence, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't the dragging noise this time. It was something else, something worse. It was laughter, soft, wheezing, and utterly wrong, as if coming from multiple mouths that didn't know how to laugh properly. The sound surrounded me, echoing off the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush, moving closer. I turned toward the noise, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was me again. Not the corpse this time, but something worse. This version of me was standing tall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes gleaming with a malicious light. It wore the same clothes I had on now, but they were tattered and stained with dirt and something darker. Its lips twisted into a cruel smile, and when it spoke, its voice was mine, but deeper, colder. "You can't leave, David. You're part of this now. You always were." I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. The other me, it stepped closer, its smile widening. "Oh, it's real. You think you can bury the truth, bury what you've done, and just walk away. It doesn't work like that." I didn't mean to, I stammered. "It was an accident. I didn't mean for any of it to happen." It laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down my spine. "You think that matters? You think saying I didn't mean to will change anything? You chose this, David. You chose to bury it, to hide it, to pretend it never happened." I backed away, my hands trembling. "I don't want this. I just want to go home." Its smile faltered, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "You are home. This is where you belong. With us." As it said the word, the dragging sound returned, louder and more menacing than before. Shapes began to emerge from the trees, twisted, broken figures that moved with jerky, unnatural motions. Their faces were blank, featureless voids, but their bodies were familiar. Too familiar. Each one bore some resemblance to me, subtle at first, but unmistakable the closer they came. I realized with dawning horror that they were all versions of me, twisted and deformed, their features distorted into grotesque parodies. They surrounded me, their movements synchronized, their blank faces turning toward me in unison. "Join us," they said in a collective whisper, their voices blending into a sickening chorus. "You can't run from what you are." "No," I screamed, turning and running blindly into the woods. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, and the laughter followed me, growing louder and more frenzied with each step. The forest twisted around me, the trees seeming to move of their own accord, blocking my path, forcing me deeper into its clutches. I didn't stop running until I tripped, crashing hard to the ground. The wind was knocked from my lungs, and for a moment, I couldn't move. When I finally rolled onto my back, gasping for air, I saw them. The figures stood in a circle around me, their blank faces staring down, their twisted limbs reaching out as if to pull me into the earth. My own voice filled the air, coming from every direction. "You can't escape, David. You belong to the forest now." Their hands closed in, cold and unrelenting, and as they dragged me into the darkness, I realized the truth. The phone, the calls, the corpse, they weren't warnings. They were invitations. The forest wasn't punishing me. It was claiming me,